I'll tell CEOs or CFOs, you're 32, you're 36, you've got 20 more years. Like, you want to be known as somebody that you deliver on all the expectations, you beat all the plans you put in place, and that will create not a following as in people will follow you, but like they will invest in your businesses time and time again because you've done what you've said you're going to do. So I always tell people, like, the most important thing is to be realistic with what you think you can achieve and when you think you can achieve it in raising capital.
Thank you for tuning in to the Mile 40 podcast. I am Bishoy Tadros, the author of Break Barriers and Audacious, both of which are sold on Amazon. And I invite you to join me as I engage with guests to discuss those bounce back moments that we encounter on our personal journey. Mile 40 is a forum to learn about how athletes, professionals, and leaders of all backgrounds stare down moments in life where the only option is to rise up. The Mile 40 podcast strives to remind listeners that the comeback is always greater than the setback. Welcome back to another episode of the Mile 40 podcast. Thank you all for continuing to tune in. I can't thank you all enough for all the support. It's been a grind week in, week out, but if it wasn't for you guys, Mile 40 would not be what it is today. If you haven't already, please be sure to hit subscribe if you're listening on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube. I'm going to ask you again, take a second, drop a review. It really helps the show grow. And I personally appreciate it. Also, check out the show notes, pick up a copy of Break Barriers or Audacious. I look forward to sending out more and more copies each week. Today's guest, I have Brendan Keegan. He's a 6-time president and CEO, 20-time board director, 2-time bestselling author, world's most innovative CEO award winner, and the visionary leader behind Be Fearless Ventures, an investment and advisory firm. As president and CEO, he has successfully led 6 companies through liquidity exits with an average enterprise value increase of up over 750%. Keegan has raised over $10 billion in capital while leading over 250,000 people globally. Today, he serves as co-owner and board member of Andretti Racing, United Autosports, Merchants Fleet, Pure Electric, Crane Paper, and Sky Meadow Country Club. Additionally, he served on the boards of McLaren Racing Indy Team, Express IT Delivery, RPI Athletics Council, RPI Lally Leadership Team, Council, and the Keegan Family Courage and Faith Foundation. Brendan, thank you for joining me today.
Bishoy, thanks for allowing me to spend some time with your audience today. I'm excited.
Of course. Listen, the resume speaks for itself, and I cannot wait to work backwards and really dive into how we got here today. And I think, like I start off every other episode, let's take things way back. Where did life kick off for you?
For me, I'd say life kicked off with a challenge. When I was born, I was born 2.5 months early, so under 2 pounds. And as my brothers told me, I was kind of a fighter from the start, and kind of got my last rites when I was born and 7 blood transfusions and wasn't sure if I was going to make it or not, but I did. So obviously I wasn't there for that experience. I don't remember it, but I think I've always been a little bit of a fighter, someone that kind of believed in you can overcome obstacles and you can get to where you want to go.
Wow, that's the perfect start to Mile 40. So tell me, where exactly did you grow up and where were you raised?
Yeah, so I grew up in a town, Nashua, New Hampshire,
okay.
Which back in 1987, the year I graduated high school, we got rated the #1 city in the country to live. It sounds like, hey, you're way up in New Hampshire. We're 45 minutes outside of Boston, so kind of a suburb of Boston.
Yeah.
So I grew up there. I've moved 12 times, throughout my career. And I only know that because my wife has counted them. She's been, we've been together for 30 years and she's been a great partner throughout my career. And now we live back in the Boston area and also, in New York, and spend time kind of splitting the two. But grew up in New Hampshire, super simple 900 square foot house. My mom never drove a car.
Oh, wow.
It's really simple. And my dad was a physicist and worked at one company his whole career. So as I've gone from different companies to different companies, he would come to me and say, why did they let you go? Why did you leave that company? Because his mindset was one company for life. And then I grew up with my oldest sister who had Down syndrome, and I was her guardian. She passed away a few years ago, but I was her guardian up through when she was 60 years old, and then two older brothers, and I was the youngest of four.
So you were the youngest of four. Wow. Talk to me a little bit more about just the upbringing in the household, under those kind of conditions. And, even your dad's career is very unique, right? We don't come across many physicists. And
Yeah,
I have to presume that that played a role in shaping how you think and your philosophy in general.
yeah. So it's so growing up in our house, like the one thing I didn't realize growing up is how much we volunteered. So on the weekends we kind of volunteered every weekend, and I didn't realize that till I was probably in my mid 20s. And part of it was with my sister, like we were always volunteering to do things for her and the special needs community. But again, on Saturday, I didn't know I was volunteering. I was like, hey, you got to go to this, you got to go to that place, you got to help your sister out. So grew up pretty simply. We ate dinner at the house every night. I grew up playing sports, so sometimes dinner would be when I'd get home from sports. And I would say I was a good blend of my parents. My mom was, artistic. She was a volunteer art teacher. Even though I can't draw in any capacity and have like no true creative, like artistic type talent. I've got a little bit of a innovative type of creative mind. And then, my dad, who was the physicist, analytical, I remember being 10 or 11 years old in our basement, building an Ohio Scientific computer
Huh.
and learning how to program the game Pong, which, is
Wow.
ridiculously simple. But I really enjoyed that. So I think what was nice for me, I was a blend of, the analytical, technical, engineering side of my dad, but having the creative, innovative side, of my mom's kind of art background.
Yeah. And, on top of that, there had to be a buildup of EQ as well, like your emotional intelligence, given what you had to probably navigate with your sister. Is that something that was you were conscious of?
I probably wasn't conscious of it. I think I did grow up probably more empathetic. And matter of fact, I remember freshman year of high school, I had a big meeting, and I say meeting with my parents and said, okay, I'm in high school now. Me and my sister shared a bedroom. We had a trundle bed, and if you don't know what a trundle bed, it's one bed on top of another, and the bottom one rolls in. She had the top, I had the bottom, and I had a meeting with my parents that as a high school student, could I please have my own bedroom and not live with my sister in the bedroom? So we built a little bedroom in the basement. So I think that what I did grow up with being close to my sister was just an appreciation of thankfulness, gratitude, kindness. The one thing that I learned the most from my sister is she never had a bad day, like in her entire life. Like, every once in a while I'd come home and didn't get the right grade or didn't get enough playing time or wasn't happy with the outcome of a sports event. And I could just, I'd be sitting with her, watching a Celtics game or Bruins game. We were big sports fans in our house. And I just saw that, like, you know, look at the hand she got dealt and she's having a great day and she's happy. And here I am moping around because we lost a basketball game. And I'd be like, get over, kind of get over yourself. And I saw some people not treat her well, and most people treat her well. But I also saw like she had just pure kindness, like just like really kind. Unless you tried to steal her chocolate ice cream around 8 at night, then she wouldn't be happy with you. But I think I that's probably some of my biggest takeaways from her, and just being kind. And it's something we've tried to instill in our two kids, is just being kind, and being kind to everybody. And you never know what battles somebody else is going through. Somebody that might look really strong, they might be fighting the biggest battle in their life. So, if they're being difficult to work with, or they're not being a great friend, or they're not being a great teammate, maybe look past it. Maybe they're battling something that you don't know. They're not doing well in school. They're having trouble at home. One of their kids is giving them a hard time. But, I look back and I think a lot of who I am, kind of came from the foundation of my family, the core values, and also being a roommate with my sister for 15 years.
Well, now that I hear that, a lot is making sense to me because I feel like that's the kind of perspective that truly distinguishes a person, right? Especially when you correlate it to now I see all the accomplishments you've done in the business world. And I think that in order to distinguish yourself the way that you have, I think requires a lot of perspective. And I think that I'm grateful that people like you have navigated the world as you have, because I think you're a trailblazer, and I think that trailblazing is rooted in that very simple foundation that you had mentioned earlier. Like it doesn't have to be hard to be kind to people. It doesn't have to be hard to lead with empathy and to listen and to lean in. Those skills aren't necessarily complicated, but you had uh, the opportunity to really live it from a young age.
Yeah, I remember when I started my career, I moved to Washington D.C. and I was an engineer with a company by the name of EDS, Ross Bros Company, and I got there in July and immediately signed up to be a little league coach. And I remember some of my friends being like, "Why are you doing that on the weekends?" And what's interesting is I didn't have a great answer because I was just sort of like, "Isn't that what you're supposed to do?" you know, and I didn't have much vacation. So that first year, Thanksgiving, I was local and I just went and worked at, a shelter and passed out turkeys and cooked and different things. And have people be like, oh, that's so nice. And what's interesting is I didn't view it as nice. Like I just viewed it as like, that's kind of what you did. And so in some ways, I'm just thankful that, I grew up in a home that was kind. I grew up in a home that was gracious. I grew up in a home that was filled with gratitude. And that just allowed me to just kind of do it. Like at times I didn't know I was. But as I've gotten older and things have gotten busier, all of a sudden, you get married and all of a sudden you have kids. It's like super easy to say, I don't have time to coach anymore. I don't have time to help that nonprofit. I don't have time to go to the shelter. And I think that's something that, as I've gotten older, I haven't let get away. I've said, no, you have to find time. And there's a term I use, and that's called conscious balance. Like, if you consciously say, these are things I want to do in my life, you can find the time. But you have to consciously find the time.
Yeah. No, I think that's so important. And, as we discussed like earlier on, I'm a father too. And, one of the things that you're always looking for or feel like you're searching for is time. And similar to you, I've realized that you need to be clear about what it is that's important to you. And if you build that clarity, you'll make the time, you'll find the time, and it won't feel like a burden on you, because you realize there's purpose behind that time. Um, I want to make sure that, we have a lot to cover when as it pertains to your journey. And I think one of the things I want to get ahead of is before you got to where you are today, what did you want to be when you grow up? Like when you were younger, take us back. What were some of the things that, are of interest to you? What were your ambitions and what really kind of excited you at a young age?
So, it's interesting at a young age, and I still remember it was third grade. I was playing football. In the first football practice, we had Coach Buchanan, and he was a tough guy. Drove a Corvette, and he goes, "Hey, I need one of you guys to jump in the middle of the circle and lead calisthenics, jumping jacks type of things." I have no idea why, but I jumped in the middle. No idea why. Probably I was just afraid of him. And I remember like leading calisthenics, 1, 2, 1, 2, and then team takes a lap and kind of finishing up by the front, and then being like, "Hey, wait, there are kids struggling to run the lap. I'm going to go back and help them finish." And then like, after practice, rounding up the footballs, putting him in the little bag and putting him in his Corvette and helping with the water. And I kind of like, I still remember I kind of got bit by the leadership bug, like just by helping out with calisthenics, helping out with laps, helping out with footballs. And then next thing you know, you're named captain. And by the way, I wasn't named captain because I was a good player. I was named captain because the next practice when we all circled up for calisthenics, I don't know why, I just stood in the middle and started leading them. And it was because like, now, by the way, the coach could have said, hey, Keegan, get out of there. That was yesterday. I want somebody else today, but it just happened. So I think what I realized is at an early age, I kind of liked the additional responsibility. I liked, pushing others to be successful. I liked helping, the weaker kid that wasn't in as good a shape finish the lap and, clapping them in. So early on, I kind of said, like I like leadership. I also had mentioned how, I built a computer with my dad. I really like technology, so those were probably the things I was passionate about at an early age. And then I remember, you go off to high school and all of a sudden it's ninth grade and there's student government and you can run for student government. And I remember freshman year said, hey, I'm going to run for class president, don't necessarily know why other than the fact that I liked leading and, wound up making it and I took it seriously. And, I think I did a good job and that resulted in, being class president, throughout high school. And I did that again through college. So at an early age, like I saw that I enjoyed leading people and that's what I wanted to do. I wanted to do it in the technology arena. So, hence, my first role was as a systems engineer with a technology company. EDS, we were the 86th largest company in the world at the time, and we were a technology company. And then later going out to Silicon Valley. But I kind of knew like, I want to get to that pinnacle. I want to be a CEO someday. And keep in mind, I grew up in a family that wasn't like overly business oriented. My dad was an individual contributor as a physicist. He worked with radio waves. My mom wasn't. So I didn't grow up in a family where my dad was, vice president of research and development or chief operating officer. And I didn't grow up in a big business town. Even though we were 45 minutes outside of Boston, we weren't like a technology juggernaut. But I found lots of good mentors in my life and people that kind of just took me under their wing, that old analogy, and just really helped me develop skills and attributes that I didn't have or I didn't know, and kind of helped mature me as a person and as an executive as well.
Was there ever any insecurity around the fact that, you were from that small town? Like you weren't from Boston, you weren't from New York, you didn't have the perceived pedigree that you need in order to fill those shoes, and so look, it's a big field, right? Like it could have been anyone else out there, and on top of that, and I can relate to this and speak to this. When your parents don't have those kind of roles, yes, there are other mentors that can pull you in and that could help build your confidence. But at the end of the day, like your ultimate mentors or your ultimate, role models are your parents. And you're always still kind of scrounging for some sort of mom, dad, what do I do here? Like, how do I handle this kind of situation? And so talk to me about how you kind of navigated all that in your head.
Yeah. So, well, first of all, I'm glad I didn't grow up with social media.
Yeah.
Growing up, I didn't know what I didn't have.
Yep. That's true.
To some extent. I remember I got on my first plane when I was 21. I was going on a plant tour to Michelin in Greenville, South Carolina. And true story, I'm flying out of Albany, New York, and they were de-icing the plane. And I remember turning to the person next to me and said, I didn't know they washed the plane before we took off. And they go, they're not washing it, they're de-icing it. I'm like, what's that? And I look back, and so to some extent, I didn't know what I didn't know. And there's sort of a beauty with that. There's sort of a naivete with that I don't think exists today. I look at my kids and they've just been exposed to
the access to information. You have it's a much more level playing field in terms of information.
Yeah, like if I wasn't invited to a party, I didn't know I was left out. If my kids aren't invited to a party, they know because everyone's posting pictures about the party. They know that China's on the other side of the world. I knew China was somewhere in the world, didn't know where. They've been on planes. So it's different. So to some extent, like I use this term fearless, like, being fearless in life. I was a little bit fearless in an unconscious state. Um, in that I just thought, hey, I can do this. And I didn't know what I didn't know. Now I will say that as I started to go through my professional career, I started to see, you know, like when I would go out to dinner, I had no idea why do we have two forks? Like I'm like, okay, like what do you do with the first one? I started to realize that okay, some of the clothes I was wearing weren't like cool. But then I could just say, okay, well, who does know and who is cool? And I remember one of my mentors saying, hey, like I don't even like wine. I go to these meetings and there's wine. And with another mentor, I said, I don't know how to golf. I've never golfed. And like, I think I should do that. And he taught me how to golf. One of my mentors taught me how to drink wine, how to swirl wine, how to taste wine, how to pick wine. But I say that, but I look back and say, that's real interesting. I had the humility to say, I don't know how to golf. And I probably need to know how to golf. Like, what should I do? And I still remember it was funny. One of my mentors, Bill Duranchek, I think he got a kick out of teaching me how to golf, just because like it was fun for him, and the age gap was he probably viewed me like more as a son than as somebody that worked for him, and now I'm 55. I can see that in myself now as I give back to college kids, where you do see yourself in them a little bit and you want to help them rise up. So to some extent, I didn't know what I didn't know, but as I started to see what I didn't know, I had the humility to say, I don't know this, and I'm going to find somebody that can teach me
Yeah.
this.
Yeah. No, I mean, I think that's, an incredibly important call out, right? Like that, the importance of leading with humility. And even with the age of social media now, I think leading with a value like humility will never steer you wrong. Even with the access to all the information and the understanding of that, of how the playing field looks now. So I think that's a really practical takeaway from that. And I'm also interested in understanding, what year did you go to Silicon Valley?
Oh, I can tell you when. 1998, as the tech boom was going. I was at EDS. I was the chief sales officer at EDS, and a number of my friends had gone out there and made millions. As startups had. I still remember one of my friends went to a startup. They were 100 million in revenue and they had a $10 billion valuation. I was at EDS. We were 24 billion and had a $20 billion. So I'm sitting there going, we're 24 billion, they're 100 million, and the world thinks they're half as valuable as us. So I sat there and said, hey, me and another friend from EDS, we went out to Silicon Valley in 98, probably a couple of years late because we were there 2 years when the bubble burst.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I mean, that's kind of what I wanted to get at there. So talk to me about, that experience, because that's something that I feel like very few of us can. Yes, a lot of us lived through the next generation through the financial crisis in 2008 and navigating that. But even, the younger people who navigated that, they weren't necessarily involved from a direct career like correlation. You were in it, you were in the thick of it.
Yeah. So, we, me and a friend went out. He went out as the CEO. I went out as the number two. And, Cisco had given us $90 million to start a company. Michael Dell had given us $10 million. So we were well funded, and we built a company up really quickly over 18 months. We were 100 million, we had $1 billion valuation. We were going public, and then the tech bubble burst and it came back down. And I remember, had bought a nice house and all of a sudden having to sell the house and move into an apartment. Rightly or wrongly, I put a lot of my savings at that point. Now, it wasn't a tremendous amount of savings, but it was all of it, into the company, because I kind of believed in the company. And by the way, at the time, you were viewing it as, wait, I can buy in at, a $200 million valuation and we're worth $1.5 billion Could we go to 5? It made complete sense,
Yeah.
but then you're selling your house,
Yeah.
and you're moving into an apartment, and if you didn't have humility,
And you're newly married at the time, right? At that
yeah,
point?
no, yeah, we got married in '97, and luckily, I had a spouse that saw it as, hey, I'm here for the long haul, and we're going to do this together. But then, I remember, and part of the reason I moved out to Silicon Valley is, as a technology person, I always viewed Silicon Valley as like, that's the Super Bowl of technology. And if I really wanted to be a technology person, like, didn't you want a seat at the 50-yard line of the Super Bowl of technology? Matter of fact, there's somebody that there's a college sophomore. He's a junior now that I do some support with, some coaching with, and I call him AI Jack because he's into artificial intelligence. And I've told him, hey, at some point, if you are a true technologist, you got to go out to Silicon Valley for a few years, just live there. And there's so many principles that I learned there, everywhere from, if you had asked me when I first moved there, what's MVP, I would have said most valuable player. I learned lessons on, obviously, minimum viable product. I got to understand, VCs. I got to understand business, but I also got to be around a lot of really creative and innovative people that thought that just thought about business models differently. And I think what I really learned in Silicon Valley was how to think about business models and how you make money. Because up until then, I more thought about how you build a company, not how you build a business model. And I'm forever grateful. I remember when I kind of lost the money we had, I remember sitting there being like, hey, I don't feel bad for myself. I'm 30. I got 20 more years to build up. I feel bad for, people that are later in their career that maybe have lost their money. And to some extent, I think some of the best lessons that I've had throughout my career came during that era, because if I look back at the company we built, probably the number one mistake we made, and I didn't see the mistake at the time, is we actually built the company too fast. And in hindsight, that almost sounds like crazy to say, how did you build the company too fast? Because when you build something really fast, it's tough to control the culture of the company. And as I've led different companies, I viewed, a big part of my role as, a leader in the company is driving that culture and making sure it's consistent across all employees, across all offices, across all geographies or practices, or however you set up your company. And I think that's one thing we didn't do as well, in that first startup I was a part of out in Silicon Valley.
We skipped this part. Where'd you go to school?
I did my undergrad at Rensselaer Polytech Institute in Troy, New York. And then I went back, nights and weekends. I got my MBA at George Washington University.
If you know me, you know that I like to look good and feel good. As an endurance athlete who trains daily, I need my wardrobe to fit the mold. Roan creates performance-driven clothing for your active lifestyle. Each piece is designed for versatility and made with integrity to outfit you for an active life lived on your own terms. The Roan promise is to help you move forever forward. Use code MILE40 for 20% off online and in-store for new customers only. Visit www.roan.com, that's Roan spelled RHONE, or find your local store and move forever forward starting today. So, even talking through these early years in the late 90s, like, you're at the helm dealing with some very big numbers. Right? You're talking about hundreds of millions, billions of dollars, right? And you were around 30, you said. Like that's a lot of responsibility for a newly married 30-year-old. And the way you're coming off right now is really calm, cool, collective, despite the fact that, even the bubble burst. But let's get into your head a little bit further around the weight of that responsibility. And back then, was there any sort of just unease, nerve, panic, around what was going on?
Oh yeah. So, I've always kind of said, there's the external side. One thing that I try to do as a leader is not take my fear and push it into others. I try to actually do the opposite. Say, if I can remain confident, or if I can believe in the future, I can inspire others to as well. But internally, I was always wrestling with, hey, what if we don't get our money out? What if we don't get our investor money back? How long is this bubble going to burst? Did I make a mistake coming out to Silicon Valley? Geez, I left this Fortune 100 company, and I got my dad telling me, why did you do that? Like, you had such a great job. You had a company car. You had a golf membership. They really liked you. Why would you go to a small startup? Why did you do that? And like, that's all running through my head. Meanwhile, I'm like packing up our house, moving into an apartment, and I'm looking back at my friends at EDS. And I don't say this like jokingly, but that they're fat, dumb, and happy. That EDS was doing well during the time. No one was losing their jobs. Nobody was selling their homes or worrying about where am I going to move my family. And you're like, man, did I make a mistake? And the one thing I would say that I'm slightly blessed with is, to a fault, is I'm always looking out the windshield, not the rearview mirror. Now, I will tell you to a fault, because sometimes it's good to look out the rearview mirror. And I wish I had maybe looked out it a little bit more at different times. But I'd always wake up and say, hey, I can't do anything about like where we are. This is where we are. Where are we going to go? How do you pick yourself up from here? But again, sometimes that's a curse as well. But, there was, if you saw me in the office, you'd say, hey, he seems pretty confident. By the way, sometimes confident is, hey guys, I don't know what the answer is, but we're going to figure it out. But if you came back to the house and we were sitting around watching, at the time, San Francisco Giants baseball game, and Barry Bonds, hitting it out of the park literally every night, and you would say, hey, how are you doing with this? And you were one of my friends, I'd sit there and turn to you and go, I'm not, some days are good, man, and some days are just like horrific. Like, I don't know how we're going to get out, but, we're going to figure it out. But I also realize sometimes as a leader, not that you're hiding that, because I don't want to perceive that as hiding it, but you do have to lead the organization and guard it from, like, it was uncertainty at that time. You're like, there were so many things that you weren't sure about, but yet you have to be able to say, here's what we're unsure about. Here's what we are certain about. And this is what we're going to do. I remember raising capital at the time, and people being like, hey, we're going to be able to raise capital. I'm like, absolutely, guaranteed we can raise capital. I don't know what the valuation is going to be, but we're going to be able to raise capital. And guess what? We did. And the valuation was crappy. But you had two choices. Accept that valuation and that capital, or don't accept it. And if you didn't accept it, you wouldn't have a business.
No capital. So go back to, the young athlete who got in the middle of the circle, for calisthenics, right? To get the team ready and jacked up and ready to go. That's a much different kind of leadership than being at the helm of a company, worth 9 figures and above at that point, right? So, was there ever, and based on your trajectory, I'm going to guess the answer to this question is no, but was there ever a thought of, man, it would just be a lot easier to be an individual contributor?
No, I like, it's interesting is as the challenge got bigger, like I just did find a way to rise to the occasion. And I mentioned, like, when we kicked this off at the beginning, I think that goes back to, my birth. Just, I've always been a fighter. I've always viewed it as, all right, we're going to figure it out. So, if I look in my career, that was the tech bubble. Then we had the financial crisis. But I got to tell you, out of all of them, the biggest crisis of them all was COVID. At the time, I was leading a company, Merchants Fleet. I joined January 2018. I had been on their board. I had been their biggest client. It was a $500 million company. We sold it 4.5 years later, and it was $2.5 billion. So we grew. And in the middle of that, was COVID. And, I still remember we, on Friday, March 13th of 2020 at 11:02 a.m., we had raised capital from Bain Capital. And we were going to announce it that following Monday. And that following Monday, I came in dressed as a leprechaun for St. Patrick's Day. and we sent everybody home. And I remember we sent everybody home for 2 weeks. We said, hey, this COVID thing's hitting. We're going to go remote. We're going to go home for, send you home for 2 weeks. Now we had to keep, of the employees, you have to keep about 100, 150 that didn't have to come in the office just because those jobs were like had to be done in the office. But I remember saying, hey, and we'll let you know what's going to happen 2 weeks from now. And, I look at the tech bubble burst, like that was like an economic thing, but the whole world wasn't going through it. It was an industry going through it. COVID, all of a sudden, like people working from home, and you had employees that are like, hey, I'm in a 2-bedroom apartment. I've got 2 kids. Like, I don't have a place where I can actually work. And it wasn't like we said, okay, page 17 says do this, like we're like, okay, we're going to get you a monitor. We're going to get you a keyboard. And you're like, hey, let's do that. Next thing you know, like the world sold out of monitors, world sold out of computers. And so like, you just have to figure it out. But what I will tell you is during that, you saw the best in companies rise. You saw the best in humanity. I remember we wound up doing Friday virtual happy hours. And we did them Fridays at 4. And I would always kick it off with a business update. Now I'll tell you let's call it the first 10 weeks of COVID, my business update was generally rinse and repeat. And it was, okay, guys, another week. We're still going to stay remote. I'm not sure for how long. Like it was like, because you didn't know.
You had no idea.
But the authenticity, the sincerity, I think employees felt comfortable that like they were hearing, we don't know. And I think that we liked it, the connectedness. Now, what we did is, and I'll give our marketing team, some credit, we did the, 10, 15-minute business update, and then we did a different thing. One would be, bring your pet to Zoom day, bring your kid to Zoom day. We did, games and stuff. And in a weird way, we actually grew closer as a company because we got to see into each other's homes. We got to, all of a sudden, somebody that I had said hi to 100 times that waved to me that really never said hi, all of a sudden they're like, this is my cat. And I'm like, oh my God, what a personality you have. In the office, you don't have this great personality. And all of a sudden you're introducing us to your cat and you have this amazing personality. Or you're bringing your kids and we're seeing into your home. And we really became very empathetic for each other. And we became very connected. So I saw COVID make us a much stronger company. It made our culture stronger. It made us closer, and it accelerated our growth because we really looked for new and innovative ways to grow. But what I would say is in those crises, I think you see companies take off. And I also think you see companies that if you wanted to use COVID or the financial crisis or the tech boom bust as an excuse for not performing, man, you had the best built-in excuse ever. You could go to your board and say, hey, we're not going to hit plan this year. And your board's going to say, we get it. We accept it. On the flip side, you could say, we're going to hit plan. We don't know how, but we're going to figure it out. And I think what I learned during COVID is, the human spirit and the human innovativeness is far greater than anything we think it is. And we had people coming up with creative ideas that we never would have come up with pre-COVID, ever.
Yeah. You know what the irony is? Like, despite the fact that, you're all remote and trying to figure it out. And, this draws exactly back to where we kicked off earlier around leading with humility. The words, I don't know, as you said, are so important to hear from a leader. And, being open and honest with your people about not knowing where the future is going to lead or how to handle or navigate a certain situation. A, it builds trust. B, it actually encourages them to learn because if you don't know, they want to be the ones to help you know. And, and the irony of it is, despite the fact you hear all the rhetoric about working from home, hearing the messaging, I don't know, fosters collaboration to figure out a solution. And, and whatever that task may be. And the last, and I think most important thing it does is it ultimately, it reduces pressure on your people. when your leader, openly says, I don't know, or the words I don't know, whether for whatever it pertains to, you're telling people it's okay. Like, relax. Like, I don't know either. And we're going to figure this out together.
Sure. I remember two examples during COVID really well that I gave on those Friday happy hours. I jokingly said on one Friday virtual happy hour, I said, "Hey guys, how many of you go to Home Goods?" And most people go to Home Goods. And I said, "Oh, we went this past weekend. And if you go to Home Goods and you find one planter for the backyard, you realize you quickly have to go to a second Home Goods because you want to get a matching one." So I said, we go to the first Home Goods and it's, hey, you got to have a mask on. Great. I drive 5 miles and I go to the next one and I don't have to wear a mask. And I drive 10 miles to the third one and it's closed because of COVID. So I said, guys, here's one company. One, you have to wear a mask. One, you don't have to wear a mask. One's closed. So I use this as an example. I said, and you know what? They're all trying to figure it out, just like we're trying to figure it out. And another example I gave is one time I said, okay, guys, we're trying to figure out return to office. And I held up 3 pieces of paper. I said, here's what the CDC is telling us. Here's what the World Health Organization is telling us. And here's what the state of New Hampshire is telling us. And guess what?
None of them.
If we follow one of these, we're going to be in violation with the other 2.
Yeah, of course.
So guys, here's the answer. We're going to do our best. There is no perfect solution. And by the way, the state of New Hampshire is not right. Who isn't right? And the CDC is not right. They're all trying to figure it out too. And when we try to figure it out, we're going to get it 75, 80% right, 20, 25% wrong. We'll fix whatever's wrong. But we also need you guys to be empathetic with us on what we get wrong. And I say that in that everybody was trying to figure it out. And there was no right or wrong. There was just, what's the most right we can get? And then are we willing to change it next week?
The truth is that, like we know in this age, we all have access to the same information, so we all can see, the conflicting reports, and so it speaks highly of a leader who, with conviction can say, like, look, no one knows, as opposed to a leader who comes in and says, I know, and this is what we're going to do. Because everyone can kind of see through that and say, like, well, why do you know if no one else, like, what do you know that nobody else knows? And so, that's a really good call out. Brendan, I know you've got, obviously a huge background here. And I know we kind of skipped a lot of things here as it pertains to your career trajectory. Is there anything that we, need to make sure that we touch on here in terms of experiences that you've had, and in terms of some of the companies that you've led? Because, raising over $10 billion of capital is no easy task. Is there a specific instance when it came to raising in particular that stands out to you?
I think, in raising capital, one area that I've been successful in is whenever I've gone out to raise capital, I've built a plan that we could execute on. In that, and when I would present to, a Bain or an ADIA or a KKR or Blackstone or whomever, hey, this is what we're going to do. When you go off and do it, it's easier to raise capital. When you build, your reputation and your company's reputation of you do what you say you're going to do, like, capital comes and finds you. And one thing that, I serve on a number of boards now, one thing that I find like challenging is oftentimes companies put plans together and you say, hey guys, like, why do you think next year you're going to do something that you've never done before? Why do you think, like, the trajectory is going to change? I go, it might, but you realize, like, you're automatically putting yourself in a position where the capital markets are probably going to reject your business plan because it's not built on a foundation of here's how we're building it, here's proof points, here's why we're going to be successful. And I hear, well, that's what they want to see. And I go, like, that's like the worst answer you could possibly give, because you might get that first round of capital, but you won't get the second round. And also, I'll tell CEOs or CFOs, you're 32, you're 36, you've got 20 more years. Like, you want to be known as somebody that you deliver on all the expectations. You beat all the plans you put in place. And that will create not a following as in people will follow you, but like they will invest in your businesses time and time again because you've done what you've said you're going to do. So I always tell people like the most important thing is to be realistic with what you think you can achieve and when you think you can achieve it in raising capital. The other thing I'd say is, on exits, equally be realistic. I'll hear somebody say, "Oh, we're going to sell our company for 10 times," and I'm like, "Okay, but your market is 7 times. Why 10 times?" And so you're almost creating this expectation where you can do nothing but like be disappointed. And I think, that a word I use an awful lot in board meetings is being pragmatic. You know, like like if the industry is 7 times, let's just build a plan around 7 times. By the way, if we get 8 or 9, that's fantastic, but don't go think you're the unicorn. And
I
I
was
think
just about to say that because I mean, like, I feel like you called out the 20-year thing earlier, right? And I feel like nowadays, a lot of early stage founders are not looking at a 20-year time horizon because, and I think I'd love your input on this. It feels like things are moving a lot faster. It feels like you don't have 20 years, the way that you may have had 10, 15 years ago now, where people want results quicker, especially investors who are getting involved with these early stage companies. And so, is it a matter of discipline and pushing back against, your inner thought that says like no, I don't have 20 years?
well, let me back up. So when I say 20 years, I don't mean in that company. I mean in your career.
Oh, okay, got it, got it.
In that typically, each company I've been in has been a 3 to 7 year run.
Yep,
For return.
yep,
But when that company sells and you go to your next company,
got it.
wouldn't it be nice if the same investment banks, the same corporate banks, the same investors come back to you and say, "Hey,
Yep.
what are you doing?"
Yeah,
And
got it.
so as I've exited businesses, the biggest compliment I've been able to get from some of those people is, "Hey, Brendan, when you land at the next company, let me know. I'd like to be a partner with you."
Got it. That makes
And
perfect sense.
that's because when you said to them, "I'm going to go from X to Y," you did it. And by the way, if they want you to go from X to Y plus 2, and you say you're going to do it and you don't, they're never going to remember that they pushed you to the plus 2. They're going to remember one thing: you didn't meet the expectations. And when you come back to them to invest in your next company, to be a banking partner in your next company, what they're going to do is say, "Hey, hey, great person, high integrity, great values, but never really achieved their business plan." Like that's not necessarily the reputation you want to build. You want to build the reputation that says, "Hey, I'd invest in this person. When they put a plan together, they really execute on it." When I say, think of 20 years, I look at it as think of your reputation and your brand, and
Got it.
you're going to be in the capital
Who you
markets.
are as a founder and someone who's going to have to deliver over and over again in different concepts, and so that makes perfect sense. Brendan, as we kind of round things out here, I want to know, what was your definition of success 30 years ago relative to what your definition of success is now?
Yeah, I would say, 30 years ago, I'm coming out of school. I'm looking. I would have said, my definition of success is, being a CEO, having a great family, a great life, and such. I would say now I would start with family. Having a great relationship with my wife, having a great relationship with my kids, being an advocate in the community, giving back, and creating trajectory for other people's lives. So my purpose in life is, and it's my written purpose. It's right here on my computer. Is to build 1 million fearless leaders. I think 30 years ago I was focused on me building my leadership. I think 30 years later I'm more focused on how do I build other leaders? Because if I can change the trajectory of people's lives, that's a legacy that's going to live well past my lifetime. And so I think that goes back to that kindness, that giving back, that wanting to see the best in others. And so I've kind of inverted my, hey, I want to be successful. I've inverted that to, I want to make other people successful. And if I can make other people successful, I will be successful just by them rising up.
I think, I mean, the one thing that all immediately stands out around what you just said there is that a true leader is a multiplier. That at its core is really what leadership is all about. Leadership isn't about, being on a plaque somewhere and getting a building named after you, as much as it is about creating, that trail. It's blazing that trail so that other people, can lead as well on and off the field. And, everything goes back to that huddle, right? It goes back to that circle when you were when you were younger, because it's a really clear visualization around, the humble beginnings of a real leader. And that's something that I want to make sure that, like, if I could leave the audience with something, it's like, you know, think of that visual, because that's where it all began for you. Brendan, I just want to say thank you for coming on. Thank you for sharing with us. We really just scratched the surface here. I feel like we could have had a couple hours to talk and really dive into everything that you had to navigate. But I just want to say I'm really grateful for the time and for you coming on and sharing with us today.
Bishoy, thanks for doing what you do. I think it's important. I know you've got well over 100 of your podcasts. I've listened to them. I think it's great. I appreciate you and your audience, and thanks for the opportunity to meet with your audience today.
You got it. Thank you. Thank you for listening today. If you enjoyed this episode of the Mile 40 podcast, go ahead, subscribe, leave a review, and share the word. Thank you for being a part of the Mile 40 family. And let's unite in showing the world that comebacks are always greater than setbacks.